I was sitting at my kitchen table with a box of my parents' financial documents in front of me. They had asked me to help sort things out. I was the responsible one. That was always the phrase they used. I had been going through papers for about an hour when I found it. A document with my name on it. A debt. A real number. One I had no memory of agreeing to. I read it 3 times. Then a fourth, slowly, because I wanted to be completely certain before I allowed myself to think about what it meant. I was certain. I closed the folder, sat back, looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. Not my parents, not my brother, a lawyer. That call was the beginning of the end of a dynamic that had been quietly running in my family for 30 years. But to understand why that document changed everything, you need to know what those 30 years actually looked like. I am the younger of 2 sons. That detail matters, not because birth order explains everything, but because in my family, it explained quite a lot. My brother Ryan is 4 years older than me, and from as far back as I can remember, the two of us occupied very different spaces in that house. Ryan was loud, charming, the kind of kid who filled a room without trying. He had this easy confidence that adults responded to, teachers, relatives, my parents' friends. Everyone found him likable. Everyone rooted for him. I was quieter, more internal. I didn't demand attention, and I didn't receive much of it. That wasn't a tragedy. It was just the texture of my childhood. Some kids are the sun in their family solar system. Others learn early to generate their own light. I was the second type. My parents were not cruel people. I want to be clear about that. They loved me. I never doubted it. But there is a difference between being loved and being seen. And for most of my childhood, I was loved without being particularly seen. Ryan was seen, constantly. Every achievement celebrated. Every setback cushioned. Every dream taken seriously and funded accordingly. When Ryan wanted to play football, gear, fees, travel, all of it covered without question. When I wanted to do something, I figured out how to fund it myself, or I went without. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way things work when you're not the one the family organizes itself around. I didn't resent it. Not really. Children accept the world they grow up in as normal. It's only later, when you compare notes with the rest of the world, that you start to see the shape of things clearly. By the time I was a teenager, I had already developed a certain independence. Not the performed kind. Not the teenager who acts like they don't need anyone. The real kind. The kind where you genuinely learn to rely on yourself, because the alternative is waiting for help that may not come. I got a part-time job at 16, saved my own money, made my own decisions, asked for very little. Ryan, at the same age, was being driven to appointments and handed spending money and having his mistakes quietly cleaned up before they could cost him anything real. We moved through our 20s on completely different tracks. I put myself through college, worked while I studied, graduated without debt. Not because anyone helped me, but because I've been careful and deliberate about every step. I found work, built a career slowly and steadily, rented a small place, then a better one, then eventually bought my own home. Nothing flashy, nothing that happened overnight, just consistent, unglamorous forward motion over a long period of time. Ryan's 20s looked very different. My parents paid for his degree, then paid for the apartment after the degree, then funded the first business idea, something in retail that made sense on paper and collapsed within 18 months. Then the second idea, then a period of drifting that my parents described to relatives as Ryan finding his path. I watched all of this from a distance, said nothing. It wasn't my money and it wasn't my life. But I noticed the numbers, not because I was tracking them obsessively, just because when you've had to account for every dollar you've ever spent, you develop an instinct for scale. And the scale of what was flowing toward Ryan over those years was significant. We moved into our 30s. Ryan had a loose career by then, some consulting work, some freelance, the kind of income that looks functional from the outside, but doesn't actually build anything. He was still in the apartment my parents subsidized, still coming back to them when something went wrong. still being caught, and they still caught him. Every time. I had a mortgage, a savings account, a career with actual trajectory. I had built it entirely alone, not with bitterness, but with the simple understanding that it was mine to build. My relationship with my parents was cordial, warm, even in its way. We spoke regularly. I visited when I could. There were no dramatic falling outs, no years of silence. Just a quiet distance that had grown naturally from the fact that we had never been particularly close. They were proud of me. I believe that. But pride and investment are different things. They had invested everything in Ryan. In me, they had mostly just watched. For a long time, that was fine. For a long time, I had accepted the shape of my family for what it was and built my life around it rather than against it. But things were starting to shift. My parents were getting older. Ryan had nothing. No savings, no assets, no real stability after 3 decades of being supported. And slowly, carefully, my parents had begun turning in my direction. Not urgently at first, just turning. And I would find out soon enough exactly what they had been building toward. It started with phone calls, more frequent than usual, longer than usual. My mother mostly. She was always the one who handled the softer approaches. She would ask how I was doing, how work was going, how the house was holding up. Normal conversation. And then, toward the end, almost as an afterthought, she would mention something about their situation. Bills that had become harder to manage. The cost of things going up. Ryan going through a difficult patch. I listened. I asked reasonable questions. I didn't commit to anything. Then my father called. That was less common. My father was a man who communicated through my mother when things were uncomfortable. The fact that he was calling directly told me the conversation had been escalated internally before it reached me. He said they needed help. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man. Just plainly. Things were tight. They were getting older. They needed someone to help them get organized. He used that phrase, get organized, and something about it sat with me afterward. It was vague in a specific way. The kind of vague that isn't accidental. I said I was willing to help. I meant it. These were my parents. Whatever the history, whatever the imbalance of the past 30 years, they were aging and they needed support, and I was not the kind of person who walks away from that. But I told my father I would need to understand the full picture. All of it. Income, expenses, debts, obligations. Everything on the table before I agreed to anything. He said, of course. He said that was completely reasonable. A week later, a box arrived at my house. Bank statements, old bills, insurance documents, folders of paperwork going back years. It was disorganized in the way that accumulates when nobody has been paying close attention for a long time. Receipts mixed with contracts, mixed with correspondence, mixed with things that had no obvious category. I set aside a Tuesday evening and started going through it. The first hour was mostly what I expected. Utility bills, medical expenses, pension statements, the ordinary financial archaeology of 2 people in their 70s who had never been particularly organized. Then I found the loan documents. There were several. Some in my parents' names. Some in Ryan's name with my parents listed as guarantors. A pattern that told a story I already knew. Ryan needed money. My parents provided it or backed it. The cycle repeated. I kept going through the box. And then I found the document I described at the beginning of this story. My name, on a debt. I won't give you the exact number. It doesn't matter for the story. What matters is that it was real and it was significant, and I had absolutely no memory of agreeing to it. I read it carefully, looked for my signature, found something that might have been my signature or might not have been. I genuinely cannot tell. The document was old. The circumstances it referenced were murky. There was a date from years ago that I searched my memory against and came up with nothing clear. What I could tell, with complete certainty, was that I had never knowingly taken on this debt. I had never sat down and said yes to this number. I had never been told clearly what I was agreeing to if I had signed anything at all. My name was on a financial liability I had never consciously accepted. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about how it might have happened. A document slipped into a pile of other documents. Something framed as a formality. Sign here, it's just paperwork. It doesn't mean anything. Or possibly something worse. My name used without my involvement at all. I didn't know which version was true. And in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with the document in front of me, it almost didn't matter. Either version required the same response. I closed the folder. I did not call my parents. I did not call Ryan. I did not send an angry message or demand an explanation or do anything that could be characterized later as emotional or reactive. I called a lawyer. Her name was Karen. She had been recommended to me years earlier by a colleague, someone who had dealt with a family financial dispute and said she was thorough, discreet, and direct. I had never needed her until that night. She answered. I explained what I had found. She asked me to bring everything in. I said I would be there in the morning. I put the document back in the folder. I put the folder back in the box. I made a cup of tea I didn't really drink. And I sat in my quiet house and thought about 30 years of watching my family operate and realized that at some point, without my knowledge or consent, I had been quietly written into it in a way I had never agreed to. The question now wasn't whether to act. The question was how far back the damage went and how much of it could still be undone. Karen's office was on the third floor of a building I had driven past 100 times without ever going in. I arrived at 8:30 in the morning with a box under my arm and the specific folder on top where I could get to it quickly. She was already at her desk. Coffee, reading glasses, and notepad. She shook my hand and got straight to it. I laid out everything I had found. She read through the document carefully. Asked questions, precise ones, the kind that told me she already understood the shape of what she was looking at. She asked about the date, about my living situation at that time, about whether I had ever received any correspondence related to the debt, whether I had ever made a payment toward it, whether I had any record of being present when the document was created. My answers were mostly no. No memory, no correspondence, no payments, no record. She made notes. She asked if she could keep the documents overnight. I said yes. I went to work, sat at my desk, did my job, came home. That night, I went back through everything I could find on my own and old emails, old bank records, anything from the time period on that document. I was looking for context, for some version of events that would make this make sense in a way that was less deliberate than it appeared. I didn't find one. Karen called me 2 days later. She had gone through everything carefully. She said the document was real and enforceable as it stood. My name was attached to a legitimate financial liability. She said the signature situation was murky enough that it was worth pursuing, that the documentation around it was thin, and the circumstances of how it was created were not clean. She said she could work through it, but she wanted me to understand that the process would involve contacting the relevant parties. That would become known I was looking into it. I told her to proceed. What happened over the next few weeks I can only partially describe, because most of it was Karen's work, not mine. She was methodical. She went through every document in that box, not just the one with my name, all of them. She built a complete picture of the financial situation my parents were actually in, the debts, the obligations, the arrangements that had been made quietly over the years without anyone sitting down and looking at the whole thing together. What she found was not a conspiracy. I want to be clear about that. My parents were not calculating people. They were not sitting in a back room scheming to use me. What they were was desperate. And desperate people make decisions in pieces, one at a time, without ever stepping back to look at what the pieces add up to. They had been funding Ryan for so long that the money had eventually run out. And at some point, I still don't know exactly when or exactly how my name had entered the picture. Whether through a document I had signed without understanding or through something that had been done without my direct involvement at all, my name had been used. That was the part one kept coming back to. Not the favoritism. I made peace with that years ago. Not the decades of imbalance. Not the fact that Ryan had received everything while I had built everything alone. What I could not move past was this. When the money ran out and the situation became serious, the solution had involved my name. without a real conversation, without my informed consent, without anyone picking up the phone and saying, "We need your help. Here's exactly what we are asking. Here's what it will cost you." Instead, my name had been quietly placed on a document and put in a box. And I was only finding it now because they needed me to help clean up the rest of it. That was the weight of it. Not dramatic, not explosive, just heavy. The specific heaviness of realizing that even your role as the overlooked one, the independent one, the one who never asked for anything, had eventually been used. Quietly, without ceremony, Karen called me on a Friday afternoon with her full assessment. She walked me through everything. The debt with my name on it, the surrounding obligations, the realistic picture of my parents' financial position. Then she told me what it would take to clear my name completely. It was doable. It would take time, and it would require some careful legal work. But it was doable. I told her to do it. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in a parking lot for a few minutes. I wasn't angry. Not the hot kind of angry. Not the kind that needs somewhere to go. It was something colder and quieter than that. The feeling of seeing something clearly that you had been only half seeing for a very long time. I had spent 30 years building a life with no help from anyone. And somewhere along the way, that life had been leaned on without my knowledge. I drove home, made dinner, went to bed, and I started thinking about what I was going to say when I finally sat down with my family. Because that conversation was coming. And unlike every other difficult moment in my life, this time I was not going to handle it quietly and alone. This time I was going to say exactly what needed to be said. Karen took 3 weeks to clear everything properly. 3 weeks of paperwork and legal process and quiet, methodical work that I stayed almost entirely out of. That was her job. I had hired her to do it, and I let her do it. My job during those 3 weeks was to behave normally. I called my mother on the usual days, asked the usual questions, listened to the usual updates about the house, the neighbors, Ryan's latest situation. I gave nothing away, not because I was performing, but because I had learned a long time ago that the most effective thing you can do when you're working through something serious is to not announce it before it's finished. I had learned that the hard way. Early in my career, I had once flagged a problem before I had a solution to go with it. The result was panic, interference, and a situation that became harder to resolve because too many people were suddenly involved. I never made that mistake again. So I waited, and I listened, and I kept my voice even on those phone calls. Ryan called once during those 3 weeks. That was unusual. Ryan rarely called me directly. We had the kind of relationship that existed mostly in group family settings. Birthdays, holidays, the occasional gathering where we would be cordial for a few hours and then return to our separate lives. His call was casual on the surface. Checking in, he said, seeing how things were going. There was small talk for a few minutes, and then, almost as an afterthought, almost identically to how my mother had done it, he mentioned that things were tight, that the family situation was a lot to navigate, that he hoped we could all work together on it. I said I was sure we'd figure it out. He seemed satisfied with that. We hung up. I sat with that call for a while afterward. The timing of it, the phrasing, the way it had mirrored my mother's approach so closely that it felt coordinated, probably not consciously, just the natural alignment of people who have been operating as a unit for a long time. They were building towards something, a conversation, a request, a formal ask. They were laying groundwork. What they didn't know was that I had already been through the documents, that Karen had already been working for 2 weeks, that by the time they sat me down for whatever conversation they were preparing, I would have my own paperwork in order. Karen called on a Thursday morning in the 4th week. She said it was done. My name had been formally removed from the debt. The legal documentation was clean and complete. Everything was in order. She emailed me a full summary, every document reviewed, every obligation assessed, a clear written record of exactly what had been resolved and how. I read through it twice. Then I printed it. I sat at my desk and thought about the next step. The next step was a conversation with my parents. Not a confrontation. I want to be precise about that word because it implies heat, and I had no heat left about any of this. It was a conversation, an adult one, where I would lay out what I had found, what I had done about it, and what I was willing to do going forward. I had thought carefully about that last part. What I was willing to do going forward. Because here is the thing, and I need you to understand this clearly. I was not looking for a reason to walk away from my parents. I was not looking for an excuse to close a door. They were elderly. They had real needs. Medical costs were real. Basic living expenses were real. The genuine human requirements of two aging people who needed support, those were real. I was willing to meet those needs without resentment, without conditions attached to every dollar. But I had limits now, clear ones I'd thought through carefully and could articulate precisely. Ryan was not my responsibility. He was a grown man who had received more support in his lifetime than most people could imagine, and had nothing to show for it. That was not a reason for cruelty. It was simply a fact. And the fact meant that whatever I contributed going forward would go to my parents directly for their genuine needs and nowhere else. I also needed acknowledgement, not an apology. I wasn't asking anyone to perform remorse. But I needed my parents to understand what had happened with that document, to hear it stated clearly, to sit with it. Because if I absorbed it silently, if I let it become another thing that was handled quietly and never spoken of, then I would be participating in the same pattern that had led to it happening in the first place. I called my mother that evening and asked if I could come by on Saturday. She said, of course. She sounded pleased, warm. She said she would make lunch. I said that sounded good. I hung up and looked at the printed summary from Karen sitting on my desk. Saturday was 4 days away, and for the first time in this entire situation, I was the one who knew exactly what was coming. Saturday morning was quiet and gray. I drove to my parents' house the same way I had driven it 100 times before. Same roads, same turns, the kind of route your hands know without your brain needing to engage. I had the folder on the passenger seat. Karen's summary, the key documents, organized and tabbed. Not for drama, just because I think clearly when things are in order. I parked outside and sat for a moment. Not nervous, not rehearsing, just present. The way you get before something that matters, but that you have already fully prepared for. I picked up a folder and went inside. My mother had made lunch exactly as promised. The table was set. There was more food than necessary. That was always how she expressed care, through abundance, through effort in the kitchen. I noticed it and appreciated it even then. My father was in his usual chair. He looked older than the last time I had seen him in person. They both did. That happens when you see people regularly on calls, but not in person. The changes accumulate invisibly and then land all at once when you're standing in the same room. We ate lunch first. I let that happen naturally. I wasn't in a rush. There was no agenda for the meal, just food and the ordinary conversation of a family that has always been more comfortable with surface things than deep ones. The weather, the neighbors, how work was going. Ryan was not there. I had not asked whether he would be, and my parents had not mentioned it. I suspected they had kept him away deliberately, that they sensed this visit had a purpose and had decided to manage the setting. That was fine. Ryan could wait. After lunch, my mother cleared the plates and came back to the table. My father straightened slightly in his chair. There was a small shift in the atmosphere, the gentle bracing of people who know a conversation is about to become real. My mother spoke first. She said she was glad I had come, that they had wanted to talk properly about the situation, that they needed to understand what kind of support I was able to offer going forward. She said it carefully and kindly. She was always careful and kind in her delivery, even when the content was difficult. I let her finish. Then I opened the folder. I didn't lead with anger. I didn't lead with the history. I didn't start with 30 years of imbalance or the childhood or Ryan's decades of dependency. None of that was the point. I started with the document. I placed it on the table in front of them. I told them I had found it in the box they had sent me. I told them my name was on a debt I had no memory of agreeing to. I told them I had taken it to a lawyer and that my name had now been legally removed from it. I told them the matter was closed on my end and would not be revisited. I said all of this calmly, evenly, without accusation in my voice, because my voice was not the place for that. My mother's face moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been relief and shame arriving at the same time. My father said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "We were going to tell you about that." I nodded. I didn't argue the point. It didn't matter anymore. I turned to the second part of what I had come to say. I told them I was willing to help them, genuinely and practically. Medical costs, I would cover them. Basic living expenses, food, utilities, the real costs of getting older, I would make sure those were handled. I was not walking away. I was not punishing them. I was their son, and I understood what they needed, and I was capable of providing it. But I was going to be direct about the boundary. Ryan was not part of what I was offering. Not $1 of what I contributed would flow in his direction. Not through them, not around them, not in any form. He was a grown man. Whatever help he needed going forward was not my responsibility to provide. My mother started to say something about family, about how Ryan was struggling, about how things were difficult for him. I let her say it. I didn't interrupt. Then I said, "I understand that. And it doesn't change what I just told you." The table was quiet for a moment. My father looked at me in a way he hadn't looked at me in a long time. Maybe ever. The kind of look that contains a recalibration, where someone is seeing you differently than they did 5 minutes ago and adjusting in real time. I closed the folder. I didn't need it anymore. Everything I had brought it to say had been said. We sat together for another hour after that. The conversation moved into quieter territory, practical things, next steps, what support would look like month to month. My mother asked questions. I answered them. My father mostly listened. It was not warm exactly, but it was honest. And in my family, honest had always been rarer and more valuable than warm. I drove home in the early afternoon. The folder was still on the passenger seat. I thought about Ryan, about the moment he would find out that the safety net he had always been able to count on, the one that had always eventually caught him no matter how far he fell, was no longer there. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, nothing would be the same for any of them. Ryan found out on a Sunday. I know this because my mother called me that evening. Her voice was tight in the way it gets when she is trying to stay composed and not quite managing it. She said Ryan had come by, that she and my father had told him what I had said, that he had not taken it well. I asked if she and my father were all right. She said yes, just shaken. I told her to call me if she needed anything. I said goodnight. I did not ask what Ryan had said. I did not ask for details. Whatever had happened in that room was between the three of them, and none of it changed anything I had already decided. Ryan called me the next morning. I let it ring. He called again that afternoon. I let it ring again. He sent a message, long, detailed, the kind of message that takes real effort to write, which told me he was genuinely rattled. There were several versions of the same argument arranged in different orders. That I was being cruel, that family doesn't operate with conditions, that I had always had more than him in terms of character and stability, and it cost me nothing to share it, that our parents were elderly and stressed, and this was not the time. I read it once. Then I put my phone down and made dinner. I did not respond. Not that day. Not the following week. There was nothing to respond to. The message was designed to produce a reaction, to pull me into a negotiation, to create an opening. I had no interest in negotiations, and there were no openings. I had said what I had to say at that table on Saturday, and I had meant every word of it. Ryan tried other routes after that. There was a cousin, a well-meaning man named Paul, who called and said he had heard things were tense and asked if I wanted to talk it through. I told Paul the first appreciated the call and that everything was handled. He seemed unsatisfied with that answer, but there was nothing more to give him. There was a family gathering about 6 weeks later. A birthday. I went because I'd said I would go, and I keep my word. Ryan was there. We were in the same room for about 3 hours. He approached me once, stood beside me near the kitchen, and spoke quietly. Said he thought we should find a way through this. Said he wasn't asking for much, just a conversation. I looked at him. I said, I think we both know where I stand. He waited for more. There wasn't any more. He walked away. And that was the last real exchange we had. What changed over the following months was not dramatic. There was no single moment of public reckoning. No scene. No collapse. Just a quiet, gradual shift in reality as the safety net Ryan had always relied on stopped being there. He had to find actual work. Not consulting that drifted into nothing. Not ventures backed by my parents' remaining money. Actual employment. I heard through my mother that he had taken a job. Something ordinary. Something he would have considered beneath him a year earlier. She mentioned it carefully, watching for my reaction. I said that was good. I'm in it. Working is good for people. My parents and I settled into a rhythm over those months. I transferred money to them on the first of each month. A fixed amount that covered their real needs, food, utilities, medical costs, the basics of dignified living. I visited when I could. We talked on the phone regularly. The conversations were different now. More honest. Less careful. My mother stopped packaging difficult things in soft language before she said them to me. My father started asking my opinion on things. Actually asking, actually listening to the answer. Something had shifted between us. Not into the warmth I might have wished for 30 years earlier, but into something real. Something that finally had solid ground under it. One evening, my mother said something I have thought about many times since. We were on the phone. Nothing particular was happening, just a regular call. And she said, quietly, almost to herself, she said she wished they had seen it sooner. I asked what she meant. She said, what you were, what you had built. She said they had always known I was capable, but they hadn't understood what that actually meant until they needed it. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, it's all right. And I meant that too. Not because everything was resolved. Not because 30 years of imbalance had been corrected by one honest conversation. But because I had genuinely made peace with the shape of my family a long time ago. The document in the box had required action, legal, practical action, and I had taken it. The conversation at the table had required honesty, and I had delivered that too. What was left after all of it was just life. Moving forward, doing the next thing. My parents were cared for. My name was clean. My boundaries were clear and had held without drama. And Ryan, for the first time in 30 years, was living inside the actual limits of his own life. Not the extended, subsidized version. The real one. I don't know what he has made of it. That's not my story to tell. Mine ends here, at the kitchen table where it started. The box of documents long since returned. The folder closed. The lawyer paid. The thing handled. I had spent my whole life building quietly and alone. It turned out that was exactly the right preparation for this. If this story made you think about your own family dynamics, the patterns we accept for too long before we finally look at them clearly, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear another story like this one, the next one is already waiting for you.